Before I tell you what I found in the readings, you need to understand something about Antarctica in the final years of the Cold War. This continent wasn't just a piece of land where scientists tracked penguin migrations and measured ice cores. It was a chessboard where the superpowers placed pieces they didn't want anyone to see. And the most empty squares on that board, the areas marked as uninhabited and restricted for environmental reasons, were often the ones holding the most secrets. My name is Captain Nathaniel Harrow, and in the winter of 1988, I was stationed at a facility that didn't officially appear on any civilian maps. My job wasn't particularly glamorous. I coordinated logistics, monitored supply chains, and kept our generators running while the Antarctic winter tried to destroy all the mechanical devices we relied on. But that winter, when our energy analyst, Lucas Wainwright, noticed something in the data that no one was supposed to see. Routine work ceased to be routine. It started on a Tuesday night in late June. The polar darkness had settled over us weeks ago, and it wouldn't lift for months. Outside, the wind howled at 60 miles per hour, driving snow and ice against our reinforced windows in waves that sounded like the continent itself was trying to break in. Inside, our facility hummed with the constant drone of generators, heating systems, and the electronic equipment that connected us to the outside world through satellite links that cost more per hour than most people earned in a month. I was in my quarters, reviewing supply manifests and trying not to think about how my coffee ration was running low, when Wainwright knocked on my door. He was a thin man in his early 30s, with the kind of pale complexion that comes from spending too much time staring at computer screens in windowless rooms. But that night, his face was even paler than usual, and there was something in his eyes that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "Captain Harrow, sir, I need to show you something. It's about the energy consumption data from Sector 7. Sector 7, even the designation was deliberately boring, designed to make you glance past it in reports without your brain registering anything worth remembering. It was one of those empty squares on the Antarctic chessboard, a zone roughly 200 kilometers south of our position that was marked as uninhabited, environmentally sensitive, and strictly off-limits to all personnel. What about it?" I asked, setting down my coffee mug and gesturing for him to come in. The protocols were clear. Sector 7 wasn't my concern, wasn't anyone's concern at our facility, but something in Wainwright's expression told me that protocol was about to become complicated. He pulled out a folder, not a digital file, but actual printed pages, which immediately told me this was something he didn't want existing in any electronic system that could be remotely accessed or audited. The pages were covered in graphs and data tables that tracked energy consumption across various sectors of our monitoring grid. "Sir, I've been running the standard analysis on regional power signatures. It's routine work, part of my job to track energy usage patterns, to make sure our own facility isn't creating interference with scientific monitoring equipment or satellite communications." I nodded, trying to follow the graphs he was showing me. Energy analysis wasn't my specialty, but I could read basic data visualization well enough to see that most of the lines on his charts showed expected patterns. Peaks during active hours, valleys during rest periods. The normal rhythm of human activity translated into electrical consumption. But one line didn't follow that pattern. One line showed constant, unwavering energy consumption at levels that suggested significant industrial activity, and according to Wainwright's labeling, that line represented Sector 7. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "According to the archive data I've been able to access, at least 3 years. Continuous power consumption averaging between 2 and 3 megawatts. That's not scientific monitoring equipment, sir. That's not a small research outpost. That's industrial-scale operation, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years." I stared at the graph, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew about Sector 7. The zone was supposed to be empty, pristine Antarctic wilderness preserved for environmental research, with no human presence beyond the occasional flyover for aerial surveys. But this data suggested otherwise. This data suggested that someone had built something substantial out there and had been running it continuously for years while maintaining the fiction that the area was uninhabited. "Have you reported this?" I asked. Though I suspected I knew that answer too, Wainwright's expression darkened. "I tried, sir. I sent the preliminary data to my supervisor 3 weeks ago, standard protocol for anomalies that might indicate equipment malfunction or data corruption. He told me to run additional diagnostics and report back. And when I reported back that the diagnostics confirmed the readings were accurate, he told me the data was classified above my clearance level and that I should delete my analysis and forget I'd seen anything." There it was, the moment when routine becomes conspiracy, when professional curiosity becomes career liability. I'd been in the military long enough to recognize the pattern. When something doesn't make sense, and your superiors tell you to stop asking questions, it means you've stumbled onto something that powerful people want kept quiet. "So why are you showing this to me?" I asked, though I already knew that answer too. Wainwright wasn't naive enough to think I could do anything about this that he couldn't do himself. He was documenting it, creating a paper trail through unofficial channels, making sure that if something went wrong, there would be evidence that people had noticed, and tried to raise concerns through proper channels. Because Sector 7 isn't supposed to exist as anything more than empty coordinates on a map, sir, because the amount of energy being consumed out there requires fuel or power generation that has to be transported somehow, and none of that logistics traffic appears in any of the supply manifests I have access to. And because 3 weeks ago, after I first reported the anomaly, 2 of our satellite communication channels started showing regular interference patterns that suggest encrypted transmissions on frequencies that aren't allocated to any facility in our region. He spread out more papers, these ones showing signal analysis that was even more technical than the energy consumption data. But again, I could see the basic pattern: regular pulses of radio traffic, encrypted and compressed to the point where it was almost impossible to detect unless you were specifically looking for it, originating from somewhere in the vicinity of Sector 7 and being transmitted via our satellite uplink. Someone out there wasn't just consuming massive amounts of power. They were communicating with someone off-continent, using our facility's satellite access to hide their traffic in the noise of our legitimate communications. And they'd been doing it for years without anyone noticing, or at least without anyone who noticed being allowed to talk about it. I looked at Wainwright and saw my own growing unease reflected in his face. We were both career military, trained to follow orders and not ask uncomfortable questions. But we were also both intelligent enough to recognize when we were being used as cover for operations we weren't supposed to know about. And neither of us liked the feeling. "What do you want me to do with this information?" I asked, knowing the question was a test. If Wainwright just wanted to document the problem and wash his hands of responsibility, he would have made copies for his personal records and moved on. But if he was asking me to take action, that meant he believed this was something that required more than just bureaucratic acknowledgement. "I want you to verify it independently, sir. Use your access to logistics and supply chain data to see if you can find any evidence of fuel shipments or equipment transfers that might explain the energy consumption in Sector 7. If we both reach the same conclusion through different data sources, it becomes harder to dismiss as equipment malfunction or misinterpretation." It was smart thinking, the kind of careful documentation that would matter if this ever became official inquiry rather than unofficial concern. But it was also dangerous thinking, the kind that could end careers, or worse, if we stumbled onto something that powerful people wanted buried. I should have told him to forget it, to follow his supervisor's orders, and stop digging into data that was clearly above our clearance level. But I didn't, because sitting there in my quarters with the Antarctic wind howling outside and Wainwright's graphs spread across my desk, I felt something I hadn't felt since my early days in service. The conviction that some things matter more than career advancement or personal safety. The belief that when you notice something wrong, you have an obligation to at least try to document it, even if you can't fix it. "Leave these with me," I said, gathering up the papers. "I'll run my own analysis using logistics data and see what I find. But we do this carefully. No electronic records, no digital files that can be traced or audited, paper only, and we meet face-to-face to compare findings." Wainwright nodded, relief and apprehension mixing in his expression. "Thank you, sir. I needed someone else to see this, to confirm I wasn't imagining things or misreading the data." "You're not imagining anything. The question is what we're actually looking at, and whether anyone wants us to find the answer." After he left, I sat alone with those papers for a long time, studying the graphs and trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a classified research project, legitimate scientific work that required security protocols we weren't cleared to know about. Maybe the energy consumption was for drilling operations or atmospheric monitoring that happened to fall outside the normal bureaucratic channels. But the more I looked at the data, the more difficult it became to maintain those rationalizations. The power consumption was too consistent, too industrial, too much like what you'd expect from a permanent facility running critical operations that couldn't be interrupted. And the hidden communications traffic suggested active coordination with outside authorities who didn't want their involvement documented through official channels. Whatever was happening in Sector 7, it wasn't something our government wanted public knowledge about. And the fact that it was happening in a zone that was supposed to be empty, in a region where environmental treaties supposedly prevented military or industrial development, suggested that the secret was worth considerable effort to maintain. I spent the next 3 days conducting my own investigation, using my access to supply chain databases and logistics manifest to track fuel shipments, equipment transfers, and personnel movements throughout our region. The work was tedious, requiring me to cross-reference dozens of databases and look for patterns in data that was deliberately fragmented to make comprehensive analysis difficult. But gradually, a picture emerged. A picture of systematic redirection and bureaucratic camouflage that became more obvious once you knew what to look for. Fuel shipments that were listed as going to our facility but that exceeded our actual consumption by significant margins. Equipment transfers that were logged as being in storage but that never appeared in subsequent inventory audits. Personnel rotations that showed people being assigned to our station but that never resulted in actual arrivals at our facility. The discrepancies weren't huge, not large enough to trigger automated audits or raise red flags with oversight authorities. But they were consistent, month after month, year after year. Small diversions that added up to substantial resources being redirected to destinations that didn't officially exist. And when I mapped the timing of those diversions against weather patterns and flight schedules, I found they corresponded with brief windows when atmospheric conditions would allow aircraft to reach Sector 7 from our position. Someone was using our facility as a logistics hub, diverting our supplies to support operations in the supposedly empty zone while maintaining the fiction that nothing was happening there. On the fourth night, I met with Wainwright again, this time in one of the storage rooms where we could talk without being overheard by security cameras or casual monitoring. Oliver Finch, our communications officer, joined us, a quiet man in his late 20s who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. "Tell him what you found," Wainwright said to Finch, who looked even more uncomfortable than Wainwright had been when he first brought me the energy consumption data. Finch pulled out his own folder of papers, these ones covered in signal analysis, graphs, and frequency spectrum charts. "Sir, I've been monitoring our satellite communications as part of my regular duties. About a month ago, I noticed anomalous traffic on several of our allocated channels. At first, I thought it was equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference, but the patterns were too regular, too consistent with encrypted digital transmissions. He spread the papers on a storage crate, pointing to specific patterns in the data. These are burst transmissions, heavily compressed and encrypted, originating from a location approximately 200 kilometers south of our position. They're using our satellite uplink to relay information, hiding their traffic in the noise of our legitimate communications. I studied the charts, my background in logistics giving me enough familiarity with data analysis to understand the basic implications. How long has this been going on? Based on archived signal logs, at least 2 years. The transmissions occur at irregular intervals, but they're most frequent during our maintenance windows, when our own communications traffic is at its lowest, and anomalies are least likely to be noticed. Have you been able to decrypt any of it? Finch shook his head. No, sir. The encryption is military grade, probably beyond anything our facility has the capability to break. But I did analyze the transmission patterns and data volumes. This isn't simple status reporting or routine data logging. These are substantial data transfers, gigabytes of information being transmitted in compressed bursts. I looked at Wainwright, then back at Finch, seeing my own growing concern reflected in their faces. Individually, each piece of evidence could be explained away as equipment malfunction, data corruption, or authorized operations that happened to fall outside our clearance level. But taken together, the pattern was unmistakable. Something significant was happening in Sector 7, something that required substantial resources, continuous power, and regular communication with outside authorities, and it was all being hidden behind a facade of environmental protection and bureaucratic compartmentalization. We need to document this properly, I said, making a decision that I knew could have serious consequences for all of us. Everything we found, all the data and analysis, compiled into a comprehensive report that can be presented through official channels if necessary. Sir, with respect, Wainwright said quietly, my supervisor already told me this data was classified above my clearance. If we push this officially, we're likely to face disciplinary action for accessing information we weren't authorized to see. He was right, and we all knew it. The military classification system wasn't designed to protect information from enemies. It was designed to control who within the system had access to specific knowledge. And we had clearly crossed lines that someone had drawn specifically to keep people like us from seeing the complete picture. But I'd spent 20 years in service learning to distinguish between legitimate security protocols and bureaucratic cover-ups. What we'd found wasn't classified to protect national security. It was classified to prevent awkward questions about operations that might not withstand public scrutiny. We documented anyway, I said firmly, not to publicize it or leak it to the press, but to have a record that we noticed, that we tried to raise concerns through proper channels, that we did our jobs even when doing our jobs became inconvenient for people higher up the chain of command. Over the next week, we compiled everything we'd found into a careful, technically detailed report that focused on factual observations rather than speculation or accusations. Energy consumption patterns that indicated industrial activity in supposedly empty zones. Supply chain discrepancies that suggested systematic diversion of resources. Communications traffic that originated from locations that weren't supposed to have any human presence. We didn't try to explain what was happening in Sector 7 or why it was being kept secret. We simply documented that something was happening, that it appeared to be consuming substantial resources, serious, and that it wasn't appearing in any official records or reports we had access to. The question was, what to do with that documentation. Sending it through official channels would almost certainly result in it being classified, buried, and potentially used as evidence against us for unauthorized investigation of classified operations. But keeping it entirely private would defeat the purpose of creating a record. In the end, we made 3 copies. One stayed with me, hidden among my personal effects in a way that would survive routine inspections, but might be found in a more thorough search. One went with Wainwright, similarly concealed, and the third went with Finch, who had family outside the military who could be trusted to keep documents safe without asking uncomfortable questions about their contents. It was the best we could do given our circumstances. Create a distributed record that couldn't be easily suppressed without someone noticing the suppression attempt. Make sure that if something happened to one of us, the others would still have evidence of what we'd found. Looking back now, I realize how naive that approach was. We thought we were being clever, creating insurance against retaliation or cover-up. We didn't understand that we were dealing with people who had spent decades perfecting the art of making inconvenient discoveries disappear. The response came 3 days after we finished compiling our documentation, though at the time, I didn't recognize it as a response. It started with Marcus Caldwell, our security chief, calling me to his office for what he described as a routine security review. Caldwell was a man in his late 40s, with the kind of rigid military bearing that comes from spending your entire career in positions where protocol matters more than personality. He'd always been professional in our interactions, competent at his job without being particularly friendly or approachable. But when I entered his office that afternoon, something in his demeanor immediately set off alarm bells. "Captain Harrow, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." I sat, noticing that he'd closed the door behind me and that the usual ambient noise of the facility seemed muted, as if his office had been recently soundproofed or equipped with some kind of acoustic dampening. "I'll be direct," Caldwell said, his tone carefully neutral. "It's come to my attention that you've been conducting unauthorized research into logistics patterns and energy consumption data outside your normal scope of responsibilities. I need to know why." So there it was. Someone had been monitoring our activities, had noticed our investigation, and had decided it was time to shut it down. The only question was how aggressive that shutdown would be. "I was verifying anomalies that were brought to my attention by my staff," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. Standard due diligence for someone in my position when subordinates report data that doesn't match expected patterns. "And did it occur to you that those anomalies might be related to classified operations that are deliberately compartmented from your level of access?" It occurred to me, yes. It also occurred to me that if those operations were legitimate and properly documented, there would be proper channels for my staff to verify that their data was accurate, rather than being told to delete their findings and forget what they'd seen. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told me he hadn't expected me to be quite so direct. "Captain, I'm going to be frank with you. You're a decorated officer with an excellent service record. You've spent 20 years building a career based on competence and reliability. But right now, you're in danger of throwing all of that away by pursuing questions that you don't have the clearance or authorization to investigate." "Are you ordering me to stop?" "I'm advising you to stop. There's a difference. If I give you a direct order to cease investigation of classified data, that creates a paper trail that might raise questions with oversight authorities about why such an order was necessary. But if I simply advise you, as a colleague who has your best interests at heart, that continued investigation would be career-limiting and potentially dangerous, well, that's just friendly counsel that doesn't require official documentation." It was a threat, carefully phrased to be deniable but unmistakable in its implications. Stop asking questions or face consequences that would be engineered to look like natural results of poor judgment rather than deliberate retaliation. I left Caldwell's office, understanding that we'd crossed an invisible line, moved from curious observers to active threats in someone's calculation of risk management. The smart thing would have been to destroy our documentation, apologize for overstepping our authority, and spend the rest of our Antarctic deployment pretending we'd never noticed the anomalies in Sector 7. But something about that conversation with Caldwell had the opposite effect on me. It wasn't his threat that bothered me most. It was the casual way he delivered it, the practiced efficiency that suggested He'd had this exact conversation before with other people who'd noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. That efficiency implied a system, a well-oiled machine designed specifically to identify and neutralize curiosity before it could become investigation. That night, I met with Wainwright and Finch in the same storage room where we'd compiled our documentation. Both of them had received similar visits from Caldwell. Similar warnings, phrased as friendly advice about career preservation and the dangers of unauthorized investigation. "So what do we do?" Finch asked, his voice barely above a whisper despite the privacy of our location. "We've documented the anomalies, created a record that they exist, but we can't report them without facing disciplinary action. And we can't investigate further without making ourselves targets for whatever system is protecting Sector 7. He was right. We'd reached the limit of what was possible through passive observation and data analysis. If we wanted to understand what was really happening out there, if we wanted more than just graphs and supply manifests suggesting the existence of secret operations, we'd need to do something that couldn't be explained as routine work duties or justified as legitimate verification of anomalous data. We'd need to go there, to Sector 7, to see with our own eyes what was consuming megawatts of power and generating encrypted communications from a zone that was supposed to be empty. The suggestion hung in the air between us, unspoken but obvious. Wainwright and Finch both looked at me, waiting for me to either authorize the insane idea or dismiss it as the career-ending foolishness it obviously represented. "It's 200 kilometers across Antarctic terrain in the middle of winter," I said, laying out the practical obstacles rather than the disciplinary ones. "We'd need transportation, cold weather survival gear, and at least 3 or 4 days of supplies. We'd also need a cover story for why we were leaving the facility, something that wouldn't immediately trigger security alerts. There's a scheduled maintenance run to the relay station at the McMurdo supply route," Wainwright said quietly. "It happens monthly, takes a small team to service equipment along the southern corridor. The route passes within 80 kilometers of Sector 7's approximate coordinates." I stared at him, realizing he'd already been thinking about this, working out logistics and opportunities before I'd even consciously acknowledged we might need them. "Who's scheduled for next month's run?" "Junior technicians, usually. People with minimal security clearance who can handle basic equipment maintenance without needing access to sensitive operational data. The kind of personnel who wouldn't be expected to notice or report deviations from standard routes." "And you're suggesting we volunteer for this maintenance run, then deviate from our authorized route to investigate Sector 7? "I'm suggesting we have an opportunity that might not come again. Caldwell's warning means they're watching us now, monitoring our activities for signs we're continuing to investigate. But if we volunteer for routine maintenance duties that are below our normal pay grade and responsibility level, it might look like we're trying to stay busy and avoid trouble rather than planning unauthorized reconnaissance." It was clever thinking, the kind of misdirection that might actually work if Caldwell and whoever he was reporting to weren't expecting us to be quite so bold. The best way to hide suspicious activity is often to disguise it as the opposite of what you're actually planning. Volunteers for menial work don't look like people planning to violate restricted zones and compromise security protocols. "And once we're out there," Finch added, "once we're 80 kilometers from Sector 7 with transportation and supplies, we'd have a window of maybe 12 to 18 hours before anyone noticed we hadn't returned to our scheduled route. Long enough to reach the coordinates, observe whatever's actually there, and get back before the deviation becomes official incident rather than potential navigation error." They'd worked this out between them, I realized, discussed possibilities and planned contingencies while I was still trying to decide whether continued investigation was worth the professional risk. They'd already made their decision and were waiting to see if I'd made mine. "If we do this," I said slowly, "if we actually deviate from authorized routes to investigate a restricted military zone, we're not just risking our careers. We're potentially committing offenses that could result in military prison, dishonorable discharge, and permanent security clearance revocation. Are you both prepared for those consequences?" Wainwright and Finch exchanged a glance, and I saw something in that silent communication that made me understand we'd already passed the point of rational risk assessment. This wasn't about career calculations anymore. It was about the fundamental need to know, the human inability to leave mysteries unexplored when those mysteries suggest that the official story is a carefully constructed lie. "I've been analyzing energy data for 8 years, Wainwright said quietly. "I've tracked power consumption patterns across dozens of facilities and monitoring stations. I know what legitimate scientific operations look like, what military installations consume, what industrial activities require. And what's happening in Sector 7 doesn't match any of those profiles. It's something else. Something that requires power levels and operational continuity that suggest purposes I can't even begin to guess at. I need to know what it is." Finch nodded in agreement. "I've been monitoring communications for 6 years. I've seen legitimate classified traffic, understood the patterns of military coordination and diplomatic communication. But the transmissions from Sector 7 are different. The encryption is tighter, the timing more careful, the data volumes larger than anything that could be justified by routine operations. Whatever's being communicated, it's substantial enough that people are willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. That kind of secrecy demands explanation." They were both right, and I knew it. Some mysteries are too important to leave unexamined, even when examining them carries unacceptable risks. And the fact that powerful people wanted us to stop asking questions, that they were willing to threaten careers and hint at consequences to maintain secrecy around Sector 7, that itself was evidence that whatever was happening there was significant enough to warrant investigation. "All right," I said, making a decision that would change everything that followed. "We volunteer for the maintenance run. We plan for every contingency we can anticipate, and we go see what they're hiding in the empty square on the chessboard." The next 2 weeks were spent in careful preparation disguised as routine duty. We volunteered for the maintenance run, citing a desire to stay busy during the long Antarctic night and help out with tasks that were below our normal responsibility level. Caldwell approved the request, probably viewing it as evidence that his warning had been effective, that we were retreating from investigation into busy work. We studied maps and satellite imagery of the southern corridor, memorizing terrain features and planning routes that would allow us to deviate toward Sector 7 without leaving obvious tracks. We requisitioned extra fuel and supplies, amounts that were justified by safety protocols, but that would give us the range and endurance needed for our actual mission. And we waited, maintaining our normal duties while counting down the days until the scheduled maintenance run would give us our window of opportunity. The night before our departure, I sat alone in my quarters, trying to convince myself one last time that we were doing the right thing. The rational part of my mind kept cataloging the risks, pointing out that we were about to commit serious violations of military protocol based on nothing more than data anomalies and institutional secrecy. But the deeper part, the part that had kept me in service for 20 years, despite seeing how bureaucracy often corrupted mission effectiveness, that part knew we'd reached a point where following orders meant abandoning the principles that had made those orders meaningful in the first place. Some things matter more than careers or personal safety. Some secrets are too important to remain secret. And when you notice that the official story doesn't match observable reality, when you see evidence of systematic deception designed to prevent people from asking obvious questions, you have an obligation to at least try to find out why. The maintenance run began at 6 o'clock, with me driving one of our tracked all-terrain vehicles, while Wainwright and Finch handled navigation and communications. The vehicle was a beast, designed for Antarctic conditions, with heated cab, GPS navigation, and enough fuel capacity to cover 500 kilometers in emergency situations. The approved route took us south along the McMurdo Supply Corridor, a marked path that connected various monitoring stations and equipment caches scattered across the ice sheet. Our official mission was to service 3 relay stations, checking equipment functionality and replacing components that showed signs of cold weather degradation. For the first 4 hours, we followed that route precisely, stopping at each designated station and performing the maintenance work exactly as logged in our mission briefing. Anyone monitoring our progress would see a textbook example of routine operations. 3 personnel executing standard procedures with professional efficiency. But at the 3rd relay station, while officially conducting equipment diagnostics, we made our decision. The weather forecast showed a brief window of relatively calm conditions, winds dropping to manageable levels and visibility improving to several kilometers. It was the opportunity we'd been waiting for, possibly the only one we'd get. Caldwell will notice when we don't report our next scheduled check-in, Finch said, reviewing the timeline on his portable communications unit. We have approximately 6 hours before deviation becomes official incident rather than potential equipment malfunction. Then we make those 6 hours count, I said, turning our vehicle away from the approved route and heading southwest toward the coordinates where Wainwright's energy consumption data and Finch's communications analysis suggested something substantial was happening. The terrain was brutal, even by Antarctic standards. We were traveling across ice sheet that hadn't seen human traffic in years, navigating around crevasse fields and pressure ridges that could swallow our vehicle if we made a single navigation error. The constant white outside our windows was hypnotic and disorienting, making distance and time lose their normal meaning. But gradually, as we pushed deeper into territory that was officially empty, we began noticing details that contradicted the official designation. Marks in the snow that looked like they might have been made by tracked vehicles, though weather and snowfall had obscured them enough to make identification uncertain. What appeared to be marker flags in the distance, positioned at intervals that suggested they were guiding traffic along specific routes. "We're not the first people to come this way," Wainwright said, pointing out the window at one of the flags. "Those markers are deliberately placed, not random debris or natural formations. Someone's been using this route regularly enough to justify permanent navigation aids." The discovery sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Antarctic cold. Sector 7 was supposed to be pristine wilderness, untouched by human presence except for occasional aerial surveys. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Someone had been traveling this route frequently enough to establish navigation infrastructure, which meant whatever was at our destination wasn't just a temporary research station or small monitoring outpost. After 3 hours of difficult travel, Finch's GPS indicated we were within 10 kilometers of the coordinates that corresponded to the energy consumption readings. The visibility had improved slightly, and in the distance, I could see what looked like a darker mass against the endless white, something substantial enough to create shadows even in the perpetual twilight of Antarctic winter. "There," Wainwright said, his voice tight with anticipation and apprehension. "That's not natural ice formation, that's artificial structure." As we got closer, the reality of what we were seeing became impossible to deny. Rising from the ice sheet was a complex of buildings, not the temporary, prefabricated structures typical of Antarctic research stations, but permanent installations built from reinforced concrete and steel. Massive generators that explained the continuous power consumption, communication arrays that justified the encrypted transmissions Finch had detected, and signs of activity, lights glowing in windows, equipment operating in service bays, evidence of human presence that was supposed to not exist. We stopped our vehicle about 2 kilometers away, close enough to observe the facility with binoculars, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. The complex was larger than our own official facility, easily capable of housing 100 personnel with room for substantial equipment and operational infrastructure. "Jesus Christ," Finch whispered, staring through his binoculars. "This isn't a small outpost or classified research project. This is a full-scale military installation, built and operated in complete secrecy in a zone that's supposed to be protected wilderness." I watched the facility through my own binoculars, documenting details that would be crucial if we ever got the opportunity to report what we'd found. The architecture was distinctly American, modern construction that couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 years old. Security fencing surrounded the perimeter, not the simple chain link you'd use to mark boundaries, but serious military-grade barriers with electronic monitoring systems. And the activity level was consistent with Wainwright's energy consumption data. This wasn't a mothballed facility maintained on standby status. This was an active operation with personnel moving between buildings, vehicles parked in staging areas, an operational tempo that suggested ongoing mission execution rather than simple maintenance. "What are they doing out here?" Wainwright asked, the question that all three of us were thinking. What requires this level of secrecy, this much resources, this kind of permanent installation in a location that's supposed to be completely off limits? I scanned the facility, looking for clues in the visible infrastructure. The communication arrays were enormous, far beyond what would be needed for simple coordination with mainland authorities. The generator capacity was massive, suggesting power consumption for more than just heating and basic operations. And there were specialized buildings whose architecture suggested purposes I couldn't immediately identify. Structures that looked more like laboratories or processing facilities than simple administrative or residential spaces. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but whatever it is, it's been running for years with resources that had to come from somewhere. The fuel alone for those generators would require regular supply runs, logistics coordination that should appear in official records, but apparently doesn't." We spent the next hour documenting everything we could observe from our distant vantage point. Wainwright took photographs with a camera that had been officially requisitioned for equipment maintenance documentation, but that worked just as well for recording unauthorized facilities. Finch monitored communications frequencies, detecting the same encrypted traffic he'd identified from our home base, but now with much stronger signal strength. And I made detailed notes about the facility layout, counting buildings, estimating personnel numbers, trying to build a comprehensive picture that would be useful if we ever got the chance to report our findings through channels that couldn't simply classify and bury the information. But as we worked, I became increasingly aware that our time was running out. We'd been away from our approved route for over 4 hours, and Caldwell would soon notice our failure to report at the scheduled check-in point. The weather window that had allowed our deviation was beginning to close, with winds picking up and visibility deteriorating. "We need to leave," I said reluctantly, knowing that every additional minute we spent observing increased our risk of detection. "We've documented what we came to find. Now we need to get back before this becomes official incident." The return journey was faster, following our own tracks through the ice and pushing our vehicle to its maximum safe speed. But even as we raced back toward the approved route, even as we tried to minimize the time gap that would require explanation, I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We'd seen what we weren't supposed to see, documented evidence of systematic deception at institutional levels. And people who built secret facilities in restricted zones, who diverted resources and falsified records to maintain operational security. Those people wouldn't react kindly to having their secrets discovered and documented. We reached our vehicle's last official position with less than an hour to spare before our missed check-in would have triggered formal search procedures. Finch immediately reported in, citing equipment malfunction and navigation difficulties as explanation for the delay, technical issues that were plausible enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But as we resumed our maintenance route, continuing with the remaining relay stations on our schedule, I could feel the weight of what we'd discovered pressing down on all three of us. We had evidence now, not just data anomalies and supply discrepancies, but direct observation of a major installation that officially didn't exist. The question was what to do with that evidence and whether we'd survive long enough to do anything at all. We returned to our facility 12 hours after departure, completing the maintenance run with perfect procedural adherence for the final relay stations. Anyone reviewing our mission logs would see exactly what they expected to see: routine equipment servicing executed by competent personnel who encountered minor technical difficulties but completed all assigned objectives. But Caldwell was waiting for us when we arrived, standing in the vehicle bay with an expression that made it clear he knew something had deviated from the approved plan, even if he couldn't yet prove exactly what. "Gentlemen," he said as we climbed out of our vehicle, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that always preceded serious disciplinary action. "I need you to report to the debriefing room immediately. There are some questions about your route timeline that require clarification." The debriefing room was small and windowless, designed for exactly this kind of conversation. Caldwell sat across from us with a folder that I knew contained GPS logs from our vehicle, communications records from Finch's check-ins, and probably a dozen other data points that could be used to reconstruct our actual movements versus our reported activities. "You were out of communications range for 4 hours and 17 minutes, he said without preamble. "Your explanation cited equipment malfunction and navigation difficulties, but the diagnostic logs from your vehicle don't show any significant technical issues during that time period." I'd prepared for this question during our return journey, working out explanations that would be technically plausible, even if they weren't entirely truthful. The communication malfunction was in our portable unit, not the vehicle systems. We lost satellite connectivity and had to relocate to higher ground to reestablish signal. The navigation difficulties were related to visibility conditions that made it unsafe to proceed at normal speed. And yet your GPS logs show that during those 4 hours, you traveled approximately 60 kilometers off your approved route before returning. That's not consistent with the explanation of relocating to higher ground for better signal reception. So he had the GPS data, or at least enough of it to know we'd deviated significantly from our authorized path. The question was how much detail those logs contained, whether they showed our actual destination or just indicated general deviation from approved coordinates. We encountered what appeared to be a crevasse field that wasn't marked on our navigation charts, Wainwright said, jumping in with the backup explanation we'd prepared. Standard safety protocol required us to route around it, which meant traveling perpendicular to our approved course until we found stable ice sheet. The detour added distance and time to our mission timeline. It was a good lie, technically plausible and consistent with the kind of unexpected obstacles that Antarctic travel frequently encountered. But Caldwell's expression didn't change, suggesting he wasn't buying the explanation even if he couldn't immediately disprove it. "I'm going to be very clear with you," he said, his tone shifting from professional courtesy to something colder and more threatening. "I know you didn't encounter a crevasse field. I know you deliberately deviated from your approved route to investigate coordinates that are under military restriction. What I don't know yet is how much you saw or what you plan to do with whatever information you think you've gathered." The directness of the accusation caught me off guard. I'd expected bureaucratic probing, careful questions, designed to extract admissions without revealing how much Caldwell actually knew. But this was different. This was someone who had already decided we were guilty and was only interested in assessing the damage. "If you believe we violated operational protocols," I said carefully, "then you should initiate formal disciplinary proceedings with proper documentation and official oversight. But accusations without evidence are just speculation, and I'm not going to respond to speculation with admissions that might not accurately reflect what actually occurred." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something that might have been disappointment. "Captain Harrow, I've reviewed your service record. 20 years of distinguished service, multiple commendations, a reputation for integrity and competence. It would be a shame to see that record end with court-martial for unauthorized access to classified facilities. It would also be a shame, I replied, if classified facilities existed in zones that are supposed to be protected wilderness under international treaty. If such facilities were discovered, it might raise uncomfortable questions about whether our government has been systematically violating agreements that were designed to preserve Antarctic regions for peaceful scientific purposes. The threat was implicit, but clear. If Caldwell pushed for formal disciplinary action, we'd push back with evidence of the facility we'd observed, forcing an official investigation that would expose secrets that powerful people wanted kept buried. It was mutually assured destruction, bureaucratic version, where both sides had weapons they didn't want to use but were prepared to deploy if pushed too far. Caldwell was silent for a long moment, and I could see him calculating risks and weighing options. Finally, he stood up, gathering his folder with movements that suggested the conversation was over, even though nothing had been resolved. "I'm going to recommend that the three of you be reassigned," he said. "Separate facilities, different operational theaters, effective as soon as transport can be arranged. Your service records will note that the reassignments were for administrative reasons related to operational efficiency and personnel management. It was exile disguised as routine rotation, a way to separate us and neutralize whatever threat we posed, without creating the official record that formal disciplinary action would require. Split us up, send us to different locations where we couldn't coordinate or corroborate our stories, and hope that time and distance would dilute our certainty about what we'd seen." "And if we refuse the reassignments?" Finch asked quietly. "Then I'll have no choice but to initiate formal investigation into your unauthorized deviation from approved routes, which will result in security clearance suspension, possible criminal charges, and certainly the end of your military careers. The choice is yours, but I'd strongly advise you to accept the reassignments and move on with your lives." After Caldwell left, the three of us sat in silence for several minutes, processing what had just happened. We'd discovered evidence of systematic deception, documented the existence of a major installation that officially didn't exist, and now we were being punished for that discovery through administrative exile that would prevent us from ever effectively reporting what we'd found. "So that's it?" Wainwright said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "We found proof that they're lying about Sector 7, that they've built a major facility in a restricted zone while maintaining the fiction that the area is empty wilderness, and our reward is separation and silence. The proof doesn't matter if we can't report it through channels that can't bury it," I said, stating the uncomfortable truth we all understood. "Caldwell knows we saw something, but he's counting on our inability to effectively document or publicize our findings. And he's probably right. Without official corroboration or institutional support, we're just three personnel making claims about classified operations that we weren't authorized to investigate." "We have photographs," Wainwright pointed out. "Physical evidence that can't be easily dismissed as false memory or misinterpretation. We have photographs that could be doctored, that show a facility we weren't authorized to observe, and that we obtained through activities that violated multiple regulations and protocols. Any attempt to publicize those photographs would immediately raise questions about how we acquired them, which would discredit our credibility before anyone seriously evaluated the content." Finch pulled out his copy of the documentation we'd compiled, the careful analysis of energy consumption and communications traffic that had started this entire investigation. "What about all this? Weeks of data showing systematic anomalies that prove something substantial is happening in Sector 7. Data that's classified above our clearance level, obtained through analysis we weren't authorized to conduct, and compiled into reports that exist outside official channels. It's evidence, but it's evidence that can be suppressed by simply classifying it at levels that prevent public disclosure. We'd been outmaneuvered, I realized, not through superior force or dramatic confrontation, but through the mundane bureaucratic mechanisms that powerful institutions use to neutralize inconvenient truths. We'd be separated, our evidence would be classified or confiscated, and within a few months, the official story would be that nothing unusual had ever happened in Sector 7, that any claims to the contrary were the result of misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation by personnel with questionable judgment. The reassignments came through within 48 hours. I was being transferred to a logistics coordination position in Germany, Wainwright to an energy analysis role in Alaska, and Finch to a communications monitoring station in the Pacific. The orders were phrased as routine personnel rotation, opportunities for career advancement and skill development, but we all understood what they really represented: institutional exile, geographic separation designed to prevent coordination and make collective testimony impossible, and an implicit warning that further investigation would result in consequences more severe than simple reassignment. On my last night at the facility, I sat alone in my quarters, looking at the photographs Wainwright had taken of the Sector 7 installation. Clear evidence of a major facility in a location that was supposed to be empty. Proof that our government had been systematically lying about its activities in Antarctica, violating international treaties while maintaining the fiction of environmental protection and peaceful scientific research. But evidence that would never see the light of day, that would be buried in classified archives or destroyed as unauthorized documentation of operations above my clearance level. Evidence that 3 career military personnel had risked everything to obtain, only to discover that the system was designed specifically to make such evidence irrelevant. I thought about destroying the photographs, eliminating the physical evidence that could be used against me if Caldwell decided formal disciplinary action was necessary after all. But instead, I carefully packaged them with copies of all our documentation, addressing the package to my brother, a civilian attorney with no connection to military service, who could be trusted to keep materials safe without understanding their significance. It wasn't much, but it was something. A record that someone had noticed, that we'd tried to document and report systematic deception, that we'd done our jobs even when doing our jobs became dangerous and career-ending. Maybe someday that record would matter. Maybe someday circumstances would change, and evidence that was being suppressed now would become relevant in contexts we couldn't currently predict. Or maybe it would just sit in a storage box somewhere, forgotten curiosity from a time when 3 idealistic military personnel thought they could make a difference by exposing uncomfortable truths. The transport flight left at dawn, carrying me away from Antarctica and toward a career trajectory that would keep me safely distant from classified operations and uncomfortable questions. As the continent receded beneath us, I watched the endless white give way to ocean, then eventually to the greens and browns of more temperate latitudes. Somewhere down there, buried in ice and wrapped in official denial, was a facility that continued consuming megawatts of power for purposes I would probably never understand. A complex where personnel executed classified missions while maintaining the fiction that their location didn't exist. An installation that represented systematic deception at institutional levels, protected by bureaucratic mechanisms designed to prevent exactly the kind of discovery we'd made. And above it all was the silence, the vast Antarctic emptiness that had witnessed everything and revealed nothing, that had kept secrets for millions of years and would continue keeping them long after the facility was abandoned or the truth finally emerged. I never saw Wainwright or Finch again after our separation. We'd exchange contact information, promised to stay in touch, and coordinate if opportunities arose to report what we'd found. But as months became years, as our careers took us to different corners of the world, and our immediate memories of those Antarctic nights became less sharp and urgent, the coordination we'd promised never materialized. Maybe Caldwell had been right. Maybe time and distance really did dilute certainty, making it easier to rationalize what we'd seen as legitimate classified operations rather than systematic deception. Maybe the human mind's need for coherent narratives eventually trumped the evidence of our own observations, letting us believe official stories because believing otherwise was too psychologically uncomfortable. Or maybe we just learned what everyone eventually learns who works in systems where security classifications control information flow, that some secrets are too well protected to expose, that institutional mechanisms for suppressing inconvenient truths are more powerful than individual determination to reveal them, and that sometimes the only rational response to discovering something you weren't supposed to know is to accept your powerlessness and move on. But I kept the photographs, kept the documentation, kept the record of what we'd found during those cold Antarctic nights when curiosity overcame caution, and we decided that some mysteries matter too much to leave unexplored. And sometimes, late at night, when insomnia kept me from sleep and old memories surfaced with uncomfortable clarity, I would pull out those materials and remind myself that what we'd seen was real, that the facility existed, that the deception was systematic, that the empty squares on the chessboard were sometimes the most crowded with secrets. The official story says Sector 7 is uninhabited wilderness, protected by international treaty and preserved for future scientific research. The official records show no facilities, no personnel, no operations beyond occasional aerial surveys that confirm the zone remains pristine and undisturbed. But I know what I saw. I know what we documented. I know that somewhere in the Antarctic emptiness, in coordinates that are marked as restricted for environmental reasons, there's a facility that continues operating with resources that officially don't exist, for purposes that remain classified at levels designed to prevent exactly this kind of testimony. And I know that the silence protecting that facility, the vast bureaucratic machinery designed to suppress evidence and neutralize curiosity, is more effective than any physical security could ever be. Because the hardest secrets to expose aren't the ones guarded by walls and weapons. They're the ones guarded by classification systems and career consequences, by institutional mechanisms that make truth-telling indistinguishable from insubordination or mental instability. 20 years have passed since that Antarctic winter. Wainwright died 5 years ago, heart attack at age 52, taking whatever certainties he maintained about Sector 7 to his grave. Finch disappeared into private sector communications work, and I lost track of him after a few years of sporadic contact. I retired from military service with my career intact despite that brief Antarctic exile, spending my final years in logistics positions that kept me far from classified operations and uncomfortable questions. My service record notes my competence and reliability, my ability to execute assigned missions with professional efficiency. It doesn't mention Sector 7, doesn't note the investigation we conducted, or the evidence we obtained. The official history of that deployment shows routine operations executed by personnel who performed their duties without incident or exceptional occurrence. But the photographs remain. The documentation stays preserved. And someday, perhaps, circumstances will change. Technology will advance. Classification systems will evolve. Institutional priorities will shift. And maybe then the evidence we gathered during those cold Antarctic nights will finally matter. Or maybe not. Maybe the silence will continue indefinitely, protecting secrets that powerful people decided were too important to risk exposure, even at the cost of systematic deception and violation of international agreements. Either way, I've done what I could, documented what we found, preserved the evidence, created a record that someone, somewhere, might eventually find useful when asking questions about what really happened in the places that maps mark as empty, because the emptiest places on maps are often the fullest of secrets. The blank spaces are where the most important activities occur, and the zones marked as uninhabited are sometimes the most crowded, with operations that officially don't exist. That's what I learned in Antarctica during the final years of the Cold War. That's what I carry with me still, decades later. when insomnia brings old memories and uncomfortable certainties. The truth about Sector 7, about the facility that continues operating in wilderness that's supposed to be pristine, about the systematic deception that protects operations from public scrutiny or international oversight, and the knowledge that some secrets are too well guarded to expose, too protected by institutional mechanisms to challenge, too wrapped in classification and career consequences to risk revealing. But at least someone knows. At least the evidence exists. At least there's a record, however suppressed and classified, that people noticed and tried to document what they weren't supposed to see. Sometimes that's all you can do. Notice what others miss. Document what powerful people want hidden. Preserve evidence that might not matter now, but could matter later. And hope that someday, somehow, the truth finds a way to emerge from the silence that currently protects it. The Antarctic wind still howls across Sector 7, driving snow against installations that officially don't exist, covering tracks that were never officially made, preserving secrets that powerful people decided matter more than transparency or accountability. And somewhere in that endless white, in coordinates that remain restricted for reasons that are never quite explained, operations continue that we weren't supposed to discover, that we couldn't effectively report, that we're expected to forget as the price of maintaining our careers and our lives. But I remember. The data remembers. The photographs remember. And someday, perhaps, that memory will matter.